Okay, so to begin with, general thoughts about the format are that sealed Baldur's Gate does not feel like it lends itself towards being a slow, value splashy kind of format, like, say, Kaldheim sealed or Streets of New Capenna sealed. There just aren't a huge number of cards that really get that kind of value and that draw cards and gum up the board and present sort of inevitability. There are cards like Tasha as a Planeswalker that allow some decks to do that, but generally they seem to be more mythics and show up in less decks. And if you open cards like Tasha or the Witch's Coven, you can kind of try to play around building that kind of deck that truly has overwhelming inevitability. But the vast, vast majority of pools that you're going to open and play against tend to be pretty driven by double team as a sort of card advantage mechanic that pressures trying to rely really heavily on removal. And so most decks seem to be best positioned when they are maximizing double team, which means trying to be more aggressive than your opponent, and that lowering your deck's curve as much as possible seems to, at least in my personal experience in the decks that I've tended to build, be more the direction you want to go. It's somewhat difficult to play even just a ramp strategy that relies on like playing an early 4/4 or 5/5 to gum up the board and hold your opponent back, because very often there will be some removal for that thing, or double team will enable too many evasive attacks that just sacrifice one attacker but keep pushing damage through. There's a lot of good, playable, cheap, indestructible combat tricks that mean that you can kind of attack into blockers and not lose things with very low opportunity cost. Generally, it just feels like a format where the majority of decks, the best build available, is aggressive, which makes it harder to be dirtily because more decks are going to be attacking you. You can't just be the better dirtily deck and not feel pressured because you're only playing against other slow, greedy decks. And that shapes a lot of what cards are good as a result, specifically what kind of stat lines are nice for creatures to have, whether you're being defensive or offensive, and also means that you do want to be aggressive, but need to, even when you are building an aggressive deck, have a game plan for, hey, how am I recouping tempo when I play against another deck that's trying to be as aggressive as me? Because a higher percentage of decks are likely to be trying to be as aggressive as you. This isn't a format where you are building aggressive decks to beat grindy mid-range decks. It is a format where I believe you are building aggressive decks with your primary thought being how you're going to beat other aggressive decks. So, with that framing in mind, and noting that the colors for double team are white and red and tend to be, in my opinion, in the vast majority of pools, the two strongest colors, or in general in the limited format for sealed, those are the two on average strongest colors, at least at the common, uncommon rarities, if nothing else. Following that, black has lots of really good solid commons and uncommons, and solid uncommons and commons, notably more so in the 2 to 3 drop range, but that's 1 to 3 drop range, that support being aggressive. So they do pair well with black and red. Black, or pair well with white and red. Black does, in my opinion, kind of fall off around the 4 and higher slot in common and uncommons, and we'll take more of a look at that when we start reviewing the actual commons and uncommons. But that means that it doesn't fill the top end of your curve as well as white or red does, outside of rares and mythics. But what it is generally adding to a deck is more on curve 1 through 3 drop aggressive options and aggressive support options that recoup tempo with effective removal, cheap good combat tricks, and powerful creatures. Green is weird. Green has powerful cards, but it doesn't have a lot of powerful 2 drops, and it doesn't have a lot of powerful 4 drops, really. Its powerful 3 drops tend to be things like 2/4s that block well, or the defining card, I think, of what green is, which is the 3 drop ramp card. The 3 drop 1/2 that taps for any color, makes a 1/1 in ETBs, and then makes a 1/1 when it dies. That is a card that ramps you into the 5 and 6 drops that green does have good cards of, while also blocking and trading effectively with a lot of the low toughness, solid red and white aggressive cards, and black aggressive cards, actually. A lot of stuff has 1 toughness. So that card is really well positioned, the Myconid, but green is kind of in a weird position where so much of its utility is defined by ramping up to 5 and 6 drops and not necessarily playing out well on curve, that it's difficult for me to say that green has a strong identity when it is not doing that ramp thing. It doesn't have a lot of cheap, tempo-y combat tricks. It doesn't have a lot of powerful 2 and 3 drop interaction or creatures necessarily. Not a lot of good proactive creatures, or not as good as white, red, and blacks. So what it can do is, like, I guess, pair with another color that has a lot of good early creatures, and green provides your kind of late game chonkers if you're trying to curve out. But most decks generally just aren't in for that. So the decks that I've had that made green look like they worked tended to be about splashing and playing expensive bombs and Myconid. I think that's kind of the biggest note, is that I think Myconid was the defining point of every pool I had that green was worth going into, or really good green rares and mythics. But, alright. We'll discuss that next. Chris from 2.5 Hours of Editing in the Future here. You may be wondering why I forgot to include blue in this in a nutshell review of the set. I also wonder why they forgot to include blue in this sealed format. For now, let's go through and start talking about specific cards, and we're going to start by looking at all the rares and mythics and trying to describe how good a card is, whether it's worth playing at all, and if it is worth playing, whether it's a card that's just like, alright, I'll play this if it's in a color, and maybe it might be better than some commons and uncommons, maybe it might not actually be worth playing, like the card that's been up on the screen this entire time, or is it something that, like, actually says, hey, I'm a reason you should be considering this color, even if maybe that color isn't providing the best skeleton for your deck in terms of just playable on-curve options at common and uncommon, which, to reiterate, I think is the consideration that's the most important for this kind of format, because with most decks being aggressive, the skeleton of your deck and the ability for it to play a good tempo game on curve is really critical, because that's the defining aspect of what separates solid aggressive decks from really, really bad aggressive decks, which I guess could also be called mid-range decks. Okay, so to start with, Archivist of Ogma, 1 and a white for a 2/2 flash creature. When an opponent searches their library, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Come to think of it, I'm not actually going to read every single card. I'm kind of going to operate under the assumption that you have read it and know what it does, or pause the video and know what it does, just to get through this a little faster. So I don't think this card is particularly good, largely because there's an uncommon flash card that people are already accustomed to playing around that is the same stat line as this and for the same mana cost. There's not a lot of value to punishing your opponent for searching their library. There is the Thopter at common that searches for a basic that this card does punish, and that shows up often enough because it's colorless and it's valuable, and in enough decks that it's, if the opportunity cost of Archivist of Ogma is low enough in your deck, and it doesn't take a lot for that to be the case, that if you're already in white, Archivist is worth running, then I would say you're occasionally going to get value out of this card, and if it draws a card and gains a life, then it's been a pretty excellent, solid use of 2 mana. But if you're looking at a deck where your color combination is already giving you like 8 2-drop creatures, and there are a number of better common 2-drop creatures than this in the average deck, and definitely some better uncommon ones, it would not be truly amazing to me to say that you end up cutting Archivist Vogma from your deck that you're playing white. But this is a card that there's nothing wrong with playing it if you need a 2-drop, but I wouldn't expect to get the search value in every game. Consider in best of 3 that if you do see your opponent playing the Thopters that search lands in game 1 and you didn't play the Archivist, then maybe you board it in at that point, but I wouldn't start with it. Or rather, I would start with it most of the time, but I think it's okay to not start with it if you truly don't need more 2-drops, which isn't usually the case. Most decks don't have too many 2-drops, just as a rule. Next up, Horn of Valhalla. I have not found this card to be a bomb, but I have found it to be solid. I will play this 100% of the time in white. Ysgard's Call is not a particularly good on-curve spell at any point, but 1/1s trade well with other aggressive creatures, so if this is like 5 mana, make 3 1/1s, it's not terribly embarrassing even at that point in the game. But what this does really well is break aggressive mirrors, where you start swinging with 1 creature per turn that it's equipped with, while still having solid blocks. And it's especially valuable because when there's lifelinkers in your deck, and there is a couple of lifelinkers at common and uncommon in white, at least one notable 2/2 lifelinker that makes the cut 100% of the time in white, in my experience. And this card's very good with that. So I would say that I don't think this card like makes you want to be white over black-red if you just open better black-red commons and uncommons than you do white uncommons. And I don't believe that it's particularly splashable, or I don't believe that you should try to splash it because the double white portion of this card is part of what enables it and makes it good. This isn't an adventure that you're going to cast just the front half of and have be good 90% of the time. If you're playing it, it's because you're planning to cast both halves of it in the majority of games. So, doesn't pull you to white, but is solid in an already white deck. Next up, Clement Novice Acolyte. This is a card that I think is very, very powerful and a strong draw to play white, but it's interesting in that it is a card that is most powerful on curve and dramatically less powerful off curve. This is one of those cards that playing it on turn 2 is excellent. Playing it on turn 7 off the top deck, really not bad, especially compared to like any other generic 2-drop, but not great. The Specialize does have some value in terms of just using up a land in the late game, but that's not why you're playing this card. Notably meaning, this isn't a card that I think there's any desire to splash for whatsoever. This is just a card that is great if white is one of your 2 primary colors and you have 8 or 9 sources of white mana to play it on turn 2. It's a strong pull to make that happen. Wouldn't splash it, will never not run it, assuming that I'm in those colors. Next up, Ascend from Avernus. So I've had this card once, and it felt like very often the best card in the deck, especially because of the way that most of the decks that I've been playing tend to lean very hard on 2 and 3 drops. There's a lot of reasons for your opponent to be attacking you, so you have a lot of control over trading your creatures off. Double Team makes this kind of better because you tend to have more bodies in the graveyard in the average game. And my experience has generally been shooting to cast this for 6 and get back your 2 and 3 drops is usually good enough for it to just be a very solid card. I would say that this is a moderate pull to white, but it is not a crazy bomb that like strongly pulls you to white. It is a consideration that is a great support for any white deck color combination that has lots of already good 2 and 3 drops. If you are somehow playing a color combination that doesn't fit that mold or doesn't have a lot of good 2 and 3 drops, first off, well, is your pool really bad, or why are you actually considering playing that pool? Because I think that having good 2 and 3 drops is the most important thing you should be trying to select your colors for in this format. But assuming your pool is bad, then this card does get worse if you can't meet that requirement and falls off a lot in power level as your deck is more about playing maybe ramp cards and 5 drops. Then this card just really isn't that impressive. Not just because it's way harder to cast this for 8 mana, but also because you're not going to put a lot of 5 drops in your graveyard fast, because you have to get to the point where you can cast them before they start dying. And you're not going to double spell them very often. Next up, Vladimir and Godfrey, 2 and a white, 3/2. Comes back from the graveyard, but only if you spend a bunch of mana, and only if you have a 1/1 creature. So, I have not played with this card. I have not played against this card. I think that without synergy, this isn't really very good, and even with synergy, that, in my experience, is kind of just the 1/1 flying Thopter that isn't the most excellent aggressive card. This is kind of difficult to enable, and once it's enabled, it's still not even excellent. You might wind up in a deck that actually has cause to enable this, but it would not surprise me if you are actively in white and you are considering playing some cards that enable it and playing this, where you might just be better off if you have enough playables that you're not really scrapped to try to find more things to fit in your deck. It might be just wrong to play the Thopters and play this, instead of just playing other stuff that's kind of better. But the red 1/1 Kobold that gives haste, if you're in red-white, is something that synergizes with this, and I would play, I think, 2 Kobolds in a heartbeat. And some decks are just only going to have so many 3-drops, and the Thopters just happen to be some of them. Then the opportunity cost to play this is not terribly high, and it becomes reasonable to play. But also a card that will sometimes be left in the sideboard and not incorrectly, I think. Next up, Champions of Tyr. This card is double white. It's not super splashable, and it's also a card whose power level is very, very tied in with being able to play it on curve. This is a bomb. It is an excellent card that super powerfully pulls you into white. I don't think it's a card that's splashable, because so much of its power level is tied up in being able to play it on curve and then follow it up with either attacking and making another copy of it and playing that card, which is the dream and is excellent, and you're probably going to win the game. One of the stronger things in the game if it doesn't immediately get removed. But part of the power of playing it on curve, even into removal, is that it buffs with either flying or lifelink or a +1/+1 counter in a very meaningful way your next creature. But if you are playing this as your last card because you were splashing it and waiting until you found your second white source for your splash, then you're probably not actually going to have another creature to play after it, even if it doesn't eat removal, or if it does, then maybe you're playing the other Champions of Tyr. I don't know. But again, you have to be able to cast the other copy, so fixing for this off treasures doesn't really work because that doesn't help double team. Basically, I don't think this is a splash. I think this is a super, super powerful card that gives you a very, very strong reason to pick white as one of your 2 primary colors. Even if your white isn't super deep, just trying to find another really deep color to pair it with to make up for that. But it's a card that hyper rewards you if you do make it, if you do put it in your deck and make white one of your 2 primary colors. Lae'zel Githyanki Warrior is one of the best rares in a weird way, because I don't actually think this is a card that is like, it doesn't fit a lot of the usual roles of what makes something a bomb in my mind. It doesn't immediately take over the game. It's just basically immune to removal and has fantastic stats for its mana cost. And that's kind of just all it does. The specialization on it is really powerful. It buffs the stats a bunch. It costs very little mana. It's flexible while allowing you to double spell. It does a lot. It's one of the rare kind of cards that's almost just like a mid-range beat stick of stats that I think is still mostly worth splashing for. Notably, of the specializations on this card, I think the red specialization is by a pretty wide margin the best one, and is the color I would most want to pair with this card. Meaning, if I was, for whatever reason, in green-black, I'd probably still splash this, especially because if I'm playing green-black, it's probably because I have solid fixing in green. But I do think that this is a less powerful card than in any color combination that has access to red. I don't think that means that if you're playing it in a white-black deck, you should splash red, because I think that just absent any other considerations, the consistency of your mana base and whatnot, not including red nonsense, is more valuable because, again, aggressive format, curving out is critical, and anything that might hiccup that by making your mana base worse is something that has a cost. Anyway, all to say, excellent card, almost always worth splashing if the splash isn't truly expensive, and a very, very strong pull into white. Next up, Lae'zel's Acrobatics. I have not yet found any deck that actually wants this. It's ostensibly supposed to be for a flicker deck, and white and black do have cards that are valuable with flickering and provide you some value, but none that are really worth trying to combo with 4 mana. If you somehow like get handed the draft version of this deck in your sealed pool that is playing a bunch of 3 mana priests that gain a life and draw a card when they ETB, a bunch of the 2/3 vampires that drain 2 when they ETB, 2 drops that have flicker synergies. You could maybe consider running this at that point, but I would just default to assuming the vast, vast majority of decks don't want this, and it's worse than just playing a random creature with stats. Stick Together. This might be one of the hardest to evaluate cards, I think, especially in the because it is such a contextual card. So one experience I have had with this card was playing a deck where I only had a single creature that survived in my deck, because there are a lot of creatures that have types like Druid or Warlock or Barbarian that just aren't part of this party mechanic. And it's not impossible to just like have a pool where nothing survives it. And if that's the case, I think this is awful. And like my experiences when I had it in hand was just I could not cast it because almost all the scenarios that I could conjure up were worse for me than my opponent. And I had to play my creatures out because my opponent was playing creatures that didn't actually die to my Stick Together, so I couldn't do the Wrath thing where I hold back and let my opponent overextend into a sweeper. So this will be hyper-contextual based on the rest of your pool, and anytime you open it, it is worth taking a look at, because if you have a bunch of creatures that survive it, then the floor on this card is a lot lower. The ceiling, you will still have this card and just have board states where your opponent has a bunch of creatures that randomly don't die to it. But I think that's worth risking worth taking that as a risk that will sometimes happen if the upside of most of your creatures survive and most of your opponent's creatures don't happens some other percentage of the time that you're playing. And that will happen. Like I said, I've had to play decks that just don't have any creatures that this protects. So sometimes Stick Together will be a very strong pull to white. In white, notably clerics are the creature type that tend to survive most often, and black has a number of rogues. There's not a lot of warriors, even in red. Mostly it tends to be berserkers, but if you open this, evaluate your pool, see if there's colors that give you a bunch of creature types that survive it. There probably won't be, but it's something to be aware of. I do honestly think that I'm probably not going to play this most of the time that I open it, but it's there. Think about it. I can't really give a strong blanket statement on it because it is the most contextual card in the set to the rest of your pool. Next up, Soon's Intervention. 4 white for an instant, create 2 1/1 night creature tokens, seek non-land permanent card, blow up an artifact, blow up an enchantment. This card is a definite pull to white. It's really, really strong. Having random artifact and enchantment destruction just happens to be relevant a pretty reasonable amount of the time, and drawing a card and making 2 1/1 or making 2 2/2s is strong enough at instant speed at 6 mana that this card's just like generically powerful, and everything else is bonus flexibility. I think that it is reasonable to play other colors even if you open Soon's Intervention. Like, it's not deeply absurdly powerful, but yeah, it definitely swings the needle towards white to a relatively strong amount. Next up, Sworn to the Legion, 4 white white. So, this being a mythic, I have not played with it, and I played against it sparingly. When I played against it, it felt nigh unbeatable in a board state that was even close to moderately equal or even somewhat unfavored for the opponent. Every creature your opponent plays for the rest of the game, getting another creature is like a truly wild amount of card advantage that nothing else does. Oh, howdy, nerd girl. This card on its own kind of shifts the paradigm of this format to me. When I said earlier that I think most good decks tend to be very aggressive because there are not tools that allow decks to take grindy sort of card advantage routes to victory effectively in the face of how effective Double Team is, this is one of the few cards in the format that really changes that. I would like more experience playing with this card to really gauge how strongly it changes how you're supposed to build. My expectation is it doesn't, because this synergizes pretty strongly with the same sorts of generic, aggressive, tempo-y cards that I already want to be doing in this format, and in white in specific. And I do believe that it is a pull towards white, but I don't believe it's worth splashing white, or I don't believe it's worth choosing white as one of your colors for this card if that comes with a cost of not having the good 2 and 3 drop curve you're already looking for by default in the format, because this is a card that really synergizes with those good curves, and this isn't the kind of mid-range card that's going to save a pool from not playing on curve effectively and then trying to like removal and mid-range grind it out of the 4 and 5 drop slot to make up for that. This isn't going to do that. It needs the support from a deck that's already playing powerfully early. Let's see. Next up, Ancient Gold Dragon. And of all the Ancient Gold Dragons, this one is by far the best. It's got the best stat lines, which once you're hitting these kind of toughness numbers, anything above 5 in this format tends to not die to most of the played removal. The, I guess, notable exception is the green instant that lets 2 creatures punch another creature. This has enough toughness to survive most board states of like 2 4/4s punching it, which is nice, and survives combat with other big dragons. 6/6s or 4/4s tend to be kind of the top end of creature stat lines. This tangos well with, but especially relative to all of the other gold or ancient dragons, this has a line of text that basically says, in the context of this format, if Ancient Gold Dragon hits your opponent, you win the game. You're going to make any more than 3 1/1s is usually enough blockers to be totally fine in most states. If you make 10 1/1 flying blockers that then get to attack on the next turn, you're golden, and that's what this is going to do, or do better 50% of the time. The capacity to lol roll with this dragon is just so low. Like, the black dragon is good, but rolling 4 is medium. You get like 1 creature back. This, however, rolling 4 is still like excellent. 4 1/1 flyers is still excellent and game winning the vast majority of the time. So, kills your opponent or forces them to chump block with a flyer every single turn, and then if it does ever connect, is killing your opponent while leaving you completely protected with no other resources. This is the kind of card that I think is worth playing around removal with, because it's so capable of winning the game on its own, and is a pretty strong pull towards white, and also kind of incentivizes you to start looking for treasure sources. But otherwise, the biggest problem really is that this format can kind of end before a 7-drop. The best thing I can say about this is that, yes, it's a 7-drop, but it's a flyer, so it blocks super well, meaning that it does a good job of stabilizing the board so that your opponent can't attack pretty immediately, which kind of helps offset its one weakness. Next up, blue. So I guess, start with the general disclaimer of blue in this set, especially in sealed, is pretty heinous. And I have seen I don't think I have had a pool where it actually felt like it was correct to play blue, with the exception of pools that I think the only really viable option was to be a green ramp deck where the splash was kind of inconsequential. And a number of the pools that I went green, red, splashing blue, I still think might have actually been better not playing blue and possibly playing slightly fewer ramp sources. I don't recall off the top of my head whether I had enough stuff in green, red to just replace the splashed blue cards with more on curve options in a more consistent pair of colors with slightly less ramp. But if I did, I think that probably would be better. Blue's just really bad. And that's partially because the rares and mythics are not, on average, super powerful in drawing you into the colors. But it's also because the uncommons and commons in blue are just really underwhelming at all spots on the curve. And even the ones that are kind of fine tend to be kind of fine in a grindy sense and not in a tempo development or recovery sense. And that is everything in this format. So blue decks tend to just have commons and uncommons that are about falling behind. And this format has lots of tools to prevent you from recovering tempo in positions where you've fallen behind on tempo. So, all of those disclaimers about why blue kind of doesn't work, let's review these in that context. So, Imoen Trickster Friend is a 2/1 that can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone, which is fine, but that means you're not doing double team stuff, which is where you're getting most of your card advantage in this format in the average deck anyway. It's not killing your opponent particularly fast. The best thing that can be said about it is that it attacks well while you're playing other creatures that block, but blue doesn't really provide those, and part of the reason that you want to be aggressive in this format is that even the creatures that do have stats well situated for blocking still don't block great, and you need to have stats that not only block fine, but also kill your opponent's attackers while not dying, because otherwise double team rewards your opponent for making just bounce, chump, and nobody dies attacks. So a 1/4 is a good blocker, but not a excellent blocker. And that kind of means that this sort of dirtle chip damage strategy that is supposed to be blue-black's whole archetype just doesn't function. But anyway, this wants you to play instants and sorceries, which is fine, except there aren't a lot of good instants and sorceries, and mostly I could start saying things about every blue card about how well, if you're in blue, then this is a good card to have, but it doesn't pull you strongly into blue in the same way that I was doing that for the white cards. But that's just really not the case. You don't usually ever have a reason to be blue, because unless your pool you opened is truly warped in a weird way where 60% of the cards you opened were blue, you just won't be in a position where you should be playing blue over some other combination of two colors that pairs better together and makes a reasonable curve. So I don't think this card is bad. I don't think that it's a reason to play blue, and I don't think you're going to have a reason to play blue, which is probably one of the more strong takes on any color I've had in any real format in the past for sealed. Next up, Stoneborn Simulacra. I think of all of the blue cards, this is the one that gives you the most reason to play blue. It's weird that you do not have... It's weird that this card is almost something I more want to splash than anything else, because it's a double blue card. I think if I open this, my first instinct is, okay, what does my green and my ramp and my color fixing look like? Because I don't want to play a bunch of islands, and I don't want to play blue creatures on curve, but I do want to play Snowborn Simulacrum. Basically what this is this is a 7 mana sorcery that puts a clone of the best creature into play and draws you 4 cards. For 7 mana, that is excellent. That is, and not even just draws you 4 cards, draws you copies of the 4 best other cards in play. That wins games at any point where you are not just hyper dead on board. So if you are anywhere even close to parity, this wins the game. But I don't want to play a base blue deck. Like, no matter what. I'm going to keep reiterating this every time I talk about a blue card. So, yeah, I almost view this more as a green card than anything else, in a weird way. But it's a very, very, very good card. When this is in your pool, you should be looking at how you can make this happen. And if that means playing like white blue or black blue, probably not red blue. Red blue's really heinous because red just absolutely doesn't have defensive options that are good. Well, it can. Red does have good cheap removal and some good blockers, but like it might be correct to play a 2-color combination with Snowborn Simulacra, but I think that's actually the second thing I would look for after seeing if I had a way to play like some other 2-color combination with good ramp and fixing to make Simulacra castable on the splash. Even though that is asking so much to splash double blue card. Next up, Robe of the Archmage. I have not played this. I have not seen it played. I don't think this is particularly good, and I don't think this is a card I would even particularly consider. Should I just stop there and stop trying to explain myself? This isn't a card that makes me want to play blue like Snowburn Simulacra, and it's not really good. It might be good if you're already blue. We're not going to get into that. We're going to save time. Moving on. Thane Evokers. I think this card's probably better than Robe of the Archmage, but I don't think that it's... Yeah, with Robe of the Archmage, you draw 3 cards. You draw cards equal to the damage the creature dealt. The idea is that it's supposed to be synergistic with the blue-black theme of making unblockable cards, and it has a discount to equip creatures that are generally the creature types that support that theme. Don't do that theme. Unless you truly find no other build of your deck that functions, it's not a strategy that plays creatures that have stat lines to be on curve and tempo-y and just doing the basic motions that you need to do to have an effective deck in this sealed format. It actively tries to pull you into playing not good creatures, in my opinion. Meanwhile, Thane Evokers has synergies that are cool. It does interesting things, but it's not good enough to be worth playing blue unless blue is somehow the only playable color. So again, we're going to be trying to say that same thing so many times for a lot of blue cards. Displacer Kitten. It's a card that has cool synergy. It does cool things. I've played a Displacer Kitten deck and liked it. Still might have been better off not playing Displacer Kitten, and definitely not a reason to be drawn into blue. And the stats are still bad. You have to go so deep to make this work. Blue not good. Moving on. Gale, Conduit of the Arcane. So it's a 4-mana regrowth for instants and sorceries. It specializes into stuff that does things. I don't really remember. What does this do? I guess the question is this worth splashing in a 3-color deck? Whenever you cast instants and sorceries, stuff happen. Whenever you cast instants, you're not going to end up with enough instants and sorceries for this to matter. So, the green one, hypothetically. Okay. So the green one, assuming that you're in a deck that wants to splash this, and green is the most likely kind of deck to end up in that position. Putting 2+1/+1 counters on a creature after specializing every time you cast an instant or sorcery is good. There is the playable green cantrip that sometimes summons a plummet that triggers this multiple times, and there is the green fight spell that's solid, and there are some green ramp spells. Although the green ramp spell, it doesn't really fix your splash very well because it conjures a gate, and your incentive is to conjure a gate that you already have another way to make colors. There could exist a green deck that just incidentally is playing enough spells that playing Gale with the idea of specializing into green is sort of a convoluted synergy that kind of does make sense. And there are some playable adventures in green specifically that could also trigger this. There are a lot of hoops that could happen in a specific perfect storm sort of world that make Gale worth splashing in a green deck, but outside of that one exception, I kind of think, once again, not really a terribly exciting card in the vast majority of builds. Gale's Redirection is a counterspell that can copy the spell that it counters that's like cool and is valuable. This is a card that I actually would want to like and would be a reason to play blue if blue didn't suck otherwise. So I guess have this on your radar. It's better than most of these. I think that it's better than all these other cards except for Simulacra as far as rares and mythics in blue go, which sounds weird, but it's a lot of tempo, especially if you high roll. But blue sucks. Don't play blue. Ithalid Harvester. This is another card that is a good card, but isn't super splashable because the best part about this card is that it's a really powerful a really powerful tempo recovery spell that helps remove a lot of your opponent's best creatures while also just putting solid stats onto the board. But you need plant tadpoles to be a castable spell, which means you need double blue, which really isn't easy to do. Some green decks with infinite fixing will be okay playing this, but again, if you're playing a lot of fixing and ramp spells that are at 3 mana, then unless you're playing the Myconid, which is the only ramp spell that really, truly doesn't lose tempo, you're filling your deck with not playing on curve, and that's not what this format wants. And this card isn't strong enough to really make up for bending over backwards to jump through those hoops to make it work. So, option to consider if that's the scenario you find yourself forced into, but don't try to make that your first choice. Your first choice should still be some kind of Mardu aggressive deck if your pool allows for it, over doing that kind of nonsense. Unless you're opening Tasha and then also, I guess, Tasha's the one thing that is such a powerful card that it warps everything around it. And this is a really powerful rare that supports Tasha and the strategy that Tasha's doing. And every statement that I'm making is kind of thrown out the door and recontextualized when that happens. But the average sealed pool where you don't have a ton of reasons to break the rules, this is not a card that starts you considering breaking the rules that we've laid down. Kindred Discovery. This is kind of that same thing. There are situations where this card is cool. The fact that it draws cards when a creature attacks is really interesting and neat and powerful. It does not pull me into blue. It does not make up for blue's problems. You're probably never really going to strongly consider this card because you probably are strongly never going to consider blue. This is not a card that breaks the rules of why you shouldn't play blue and requires some other condition that breaks those rules to have been met before it would be a card that I would want to consider playing or splashing. Kalim Jin Emperor. This is probably one of the closer cards to breaking the rules for blue enough to make me interested in blue. Still not interested in playing blue, but basically, I think Kalim is a reasonable splash card. You don't ever actually have to cast it. You can just keep playing Kalim's Breath over and over, which is fine. I don't even know if that's fine. You know what? Okay. This is a card you can play if you're in green with a bunch of random color fixing already. I keep saying that. I don't think this strongly pulls me into blue. I don't think this is worth splashing in the average deck, because it takes so long to be more than neutral. Or more than tempo kind of pseudo-negative at best while cantripping. It's just, nah. Still a blue card. Still the same rules. Signature spells. This is awful. Again, double blue. Has to jump through a ton of hoops before it's good. You could conceivably come up with a deck that is only playing 2 or 3 removal spells where signature spells starts casting a removal spell every turn consistently 100% of the time you cast it. That's like the best case scenario for this card, and it's almost pushing worth playing blue at that point in the best case scenario in a deck that's then presumably blue black or like maybe blue red, because white doesn't get like good removal spells that work for the timing that signature spells is operating on. You're, I guess, looking at like Dragonfire, Mephit's Rage, the 3 mana black instant that gives -2/-2 perpetually and then shrinks the creature every turn after that. Has to be exactly. Oh, wow. Oh, I thought it was 3 or less. Okay, so one thing then, I've been misevaluating this card. You don't get a fizzle rate then for it playing 1 and 2 drops, meaning there are very, very few cards this seeks, and you have to be concerned about drawing the cards that it seeks before you draw signature spells. So basically the only use case for this that I can think of then, because I can't think of very many 3-mana removal spells, there is just the black perpetual spell, and that's it? I think? Nothing else comes to mind. So if you end up with a deck that has 3 copies of, what is that, Sewer Plague, I think is the name? If you end up with a pool that has 3 Sewer Plagues and signature spells, improvised weaponry, yeah, but that's not... I don't think improvised weaponry is actually good enough to play this. Casting an improvised weaponry that is not a removal spell for a large creature every turn is not a strong enough reason to be playing blue. But, and Grave Choice. Yeah, Grave Choice might be close enough to reasonable. I don't love Edicts, but I do kind of dig an Edict every turn. But, so like, if you end up with 2 at the minimum, 3 probably this starts to be interesting. 3 3-mana removal spells that are hard removal spells and signature spells is like the only way I would ever play this card, ever. And 99.9% of pools are not going to have that option. Ancient Silver Dragon. I don't like this. This is really bad, and it's not a reason to play blue. It's hyper expensive. The ability has a decent chance of killing you when you actually connect in limited, and the stats are fine. Notably, like, if you hit your opponent for 8 before, and the 8 kills them, the game ends before you have a chance to kill yourself by rolling 20 and decking. But, like, yeah, this is really bad. Don't play this. An 8-mana 8/8 flyer is not interesting, even if you're in ramp, and especially isn't interesting in the context of how fast this format is. And this is like an 8/8 flyer for 8 with a downside. It is bad. Moving on. Altar Ball. This card's very good and a strong pull to black. It gives you a powerful creature on 3 that I would just play as a creature. 4/1 Menace is solid. Admittedly, tapped is kind of a downside, but most of the value of the card is the recurring flicker effect / reanimation effect on the backside that turns every creature into your best creature that your opponent killed. Over and over and over. Rebuying flicker effects is cool. Notably, and this is a mistake I made, it does require as a cost that you exile the creature. It does not sacrifice the creature that the altar is, quote, sacrificing. So you can't just loop 2 ETB creatures back and forth. For what that matters as far as like how you're debating playing against it, but just play this 100% of the time. It's really good. And it's not a bomb that like mandates you play black, but it's very strong. Shadowheart, Sharan Cleric, 1 in the black, 2/2 legendary creature, yada yada yada. This card's very good. It supports what you should already be doing, which is an aggressive strategy. The best specialization typically is black, because it turns it into a 4/4 lifelinker, which often busts down a lot of board stalls, but it has other specializations. I've read them. I've never seen them, but this card's good. A reason to be in black. A very supportive card for aggressive strategies, which are the strategies you should be trying to build your pool around anyway. Fills your curve with a good on-curve creature, which is one of the limitations of what colors you can pick, so it kind of makes black into a more playable color on its own. Stroke of Luck. 1 in a black. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, choose one of them, and put all the cards with the same name as the chosen card into your hand. You lose 1 life. I did originally underrate this card. This is a little better than Anticipate, except for 4. Because you have a lot of duplicates of basic lands in your deck. There's a reasonable chance that Stroke of Luck, if you're using it to try to draw lands because you kept a land light hand that maybe is stuck on 2 or 3, draws 2 lands. So in the position where you are using this to dig for lands, it's actually very good at finding multiple lands and smoothing out the rest of your game all at once. But when it isn't doing that, it digs for your bombs, and that's good. It has the problem of, this is a format where I feel very strongly that I want to be tempo-y, and this is not tempo, but missing land drops is also not tempo. And when you need to play off-tempo, because you don't have creatures you can cast, this is something that's free. And in the late game, when you're sort of running out of things to do, which happens later in this format than most because of the way Double Team works, giving you more things to do, this still helps find your bomb. It's a good card. I would always play this if I'm in black. It's not a strong draw towards black, but it's solid. Channel point stuff is off right now because I am trying to stay on topic for this and be concise about it so that we can make a somewhat shorter video out of it. Although we're already kind of an hour in and I was hoping to make the entire video an hour, so that's not succeeding. I might have to do a lot of editing for it, or just make peace with it being a longer video. Next up, Black Mark Connections. 2 in a black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, choose 1 or more, create a treasure token and lose a life, draw a card, lose 2 life, create a 3/2 colorless shapeshifter creature token with changeling, lose 3 life. I was originally pretty excited about this card. I think in practice I've actually been more interested in not actually playing it at all. The more that my experience with this format, or rather, the more my experience with how other people are approaching this format is that most decks are pretty aggressive, means that the fact that at minimum this loses you 1 life a turn is an element of self-drain that's concerning. So the idea is that the turn this comes down, when you have plenty of life, you're immediately making a 3/2, and you're making a treasure. And then you are on a clock. So if your deck is a very good, hyper-aggressive deck, that start, and then making a treasure every turn, is a lot of tempo that you can convert into a win. You can do that. But if your deck is not capable of just being super linear, hyper-aggressive with very good reach, you can be in black and choose not to play this card, and that's possibly correct. I do feel like I need a lot more experience with this card. I do not feel as confident with that judgment of the card, although all of my evidence so far seems to indicate that's the right take on it. But be willing to make your own conclusions on this, I guess. I'm not as confident, but yeah, I'd start with probably don't play this card if you are anything less than very aggressive and confident you are good at being aggressive deck. Next up, Wand of Orcus. 3 mana equipment, equip 3. Whenever equipped creature attacks or blocks, it gains Death Touch. And when it deals combat damage, when equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, create them any 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. This is pretty expensive. I don't think that it's powerful enough to be a strong draw towards black. It does not make up for choosing to play black if black is not a card that, or not the color that results in your best curve out 2-color combination. But what it does do is gives a lot of flexibility to an aggressive deck that stalls out. Because Wand of Orcus lets you start trading 1 attacker with Death Touch into their board every turn, and kind of takes over the game once you have ever connected once with an equipped creature, and in that sense it synergizes pretty well with flyers. The biggest note is that it gives blockers Death Touch, which I actually missed, meaning that if you have a bunch of mana in the late game and you've somehow reached the late game in this format, You get to start moving it around between the 2/2s that you make to also get Death Touch on blocks, which really, really gums up combat math for your opponent. But solid card, worth playing if you have it, if you're in black for existing reasons. A draw towards black, but not like a super strong draw towards black. Next up, Grim Hireling. This is a card that does pull you towards black, because you should already be wanting to attack. The stat lines on this aren't excellent and not evasive, but in any position where the attacks that you probably should already be making actually connect, it immediately skyrockets you ahead by both accelerating you and starting to provide you with removal spells on sticks that make future math all sorts of interesting shenaniganry. Important note, this is restricted to being activated as a sorcery when you give stuff -X/-X, but remember that you can do it in the second main phase. So you don't need to, in main phase 1, shrink their 2/4 into an 0/2 so that your 3/2 can get in and be unblocked. That might be what you want to do, but you can also just attack with the 3/2 into the 2/4 and then activate the ability and just accept the 1/1 and kill their creature in the second main phase if you want to commit the lowest amount of resources on the off chance they don't block, but still kill their creature if they do block. Something to consider. Next up, Intellect Devourer. My experience with this card was really unimpressive. I was doing everything I could to maximize it, and the result was still just really underwhelming. The stat line is not good. It is not a good attacker, which is what I want to be doing in the format. Your opponent has all the control over what card gets exiled, meaning they can just give you kind of a bad card. If you do manage to, play Intellect Devourer when they have one card left in hand, hoping that it's an expensive bomb they haven't hit the land drops to play yet, then, you win. But the amount of hoops you have to jump through and the lack of reliability of how often you're going to be able to successfully jump through those hoops and the bad base rate of the card just make me really unimpressed with this. I think this is the kind of card that's, potentially almost weak enough that you just leave it on the shelf even if you're in black. Maybe sometimes you won't because you just have other stuff to do, but if you are asking yourself if you should feel forced to play Intellect Devourer, if you just don't understand it, and that maybe it's better than you think, don't think that. It is completely fine to cut this card and just play something else random, common. There are better commons than this, for sure. Following that up, Packed Weapon. This card is very excellent. It pumps your creatures when you're attacking. It's card draw. I think that the majority of this card, though, in my experience playing against it, has been how incredibly annoying it is to not have a removal spell anymore while playing against a Packed Weapon and just sit there going, I have to top deck a removal spell for Packed Weapon or the creature that it's attached to, or else I just can never, ever win the game. And that's just so incredibly powerful that, that makes this a very, very powerful bomb. This is essentially 4 mana Platinum Angel, except you have to, discard a card to get the Platinum Angel and have another creature in play, but that's trivial. Deeply excellent. Deeply, deeply, deeply excellent. A very strong draw towards black. Hourglass Coven. This is probably the best rare in the set. Probably the best rare or mythic in the set. It's that or it's that or Lae'zel, probably, in terms of, impact immediately and difficulty to remove. This card's fantastic. It is a huge draw towards black. You should probably the majority of the time you open this splash it, or play black, almost no matter how bad the rest of your black is. And if you are not playing black, you should probably be playing green and enough color fixing to play this. Hyper powerful, hyper powerful. Cannot overstate how hyper powerful it is enough. It creates so many different bodies. It instantly recovers infinity tempo. All of the bodies have really powerful abilities. It pairs well with reanimation effects. It's excellent. Excellent in every way. Ancient Brass Dragon. Played with this the other day, was really impressed by it with haste. The toughness is kind of a little on the scary low side. 7 mana is a lot, but this is the kind of card that can recover board states where you were not hyper favored, and just if the opponent runs out of flyers, this connecting once flips for your opponent from having 20 life and an advantageous board state to maybe your opponent is now really behind. So very powerful, a draw into black, weaker than the white version of this card, expensive, but black is the color that makes treasures, so the expense, even though this is the same mana cost as the white dragon, I think that the average deck is going to have an easier time casting this than the white dragon, just because black natively makes treasures on its own. A good card. A good card. Blood Money. So 7 mana Wrath, destroy all creatures. For each non-token creature, make a tapped treasure token. Notably, tapped treasure token means you can't just play Blood Money and then immediately empty your hand on crowded board states that the nature of Double Team tends to make for crowded board states. So mostly this is just a Wrath as far as limited cares, and 7 mana Wrath in limited is good. It's good. So yeah, if you're in black, play it. Consider its effect on your lines as you're choosing them. Obviously, if it's in your hand, that should be on your mind. And if it's in your deck, maybe consider whether playing to drawing Blood Money is a better out than trying to play to the board as the board stands. Maybe you hold creatures, maybe not. It's, again, contextual, but something to think about. But not a hyper bomb in the sense that some 7 mana Wraths have been that were one-sided. This is basically just Wrath of God for the purposes of limited, but really expensive, which really expensive Wrath of God is still a playable card. Eldritch Pact. 7 mana, target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of cards in their graveyard. For the most part, I guess this, my experience with this card has been that it was Lava Axe more than anything else, which just isn't super appealing at 7 mana. I don't think that this is a format where you want to be playing 7 mana draw cards that lose life. It is not very good. I don't strongly consider this as a card that exists when evaluating how to build your pool. Okay, on to red. Tiefling Outcast is... There's not a lot of Tiefling, Devil, Imps, or Demons synergies. There's some Demons, but mostly at higher rarities, I guess. There are randomly other Tieflings that this is pretty strong with. This card's fine. It's good on turn 1. The biggest problem with this compared to other Double Team cards is that it's really, really, really easy to block Tiefling Outcasts, the first one that attacks in and triggers Double Team, with a block that just kills the attacker and doesn't lose a creature. And that kind of is the defining aspect of when Double Team cards are good and how you want to play around Double Team cards. Double Team cards are bad if the attacker dies and doesn't kill anything. In that case, the Double Team card has done basically nothing and you're just playing a slightly below stat creature. If the Double Team creature either trades or doesn't die, then it's very, very good. That holds true for basically every Double Team creature that there is. Tiefling Outcasts, the upside of when you just play this on turn 1 is pretty high, and when it starts to be an anthem for any other Tieflings is pretty high, and if you just need more stuff on curve or lower on the curve, this fills that role. I don't actually think it's a really strong draw towards red, though. If I was comparing this card to the 2 mana 1/3 Double Team that for 2 mana pumps every copy of itself in play, I think this is actually probably worse than that common in the vast, vast majority of decks. So, yeah, not great, but playable. Fiend Lash. This is probably the card I've had the most contentious experience with. It's good. It does a really weird Lava Axe impression in the sense that if you have been aggressive and stalled out the board state, This lets you start sinking mana into equipping creatures and throwing them at your opponent's wall and just sacking them over and over to do damage to the opponent. And like, that is sometimes fine. And getting reach is a cool benefit in those sort of stalled out board states. The biggest problem I've had with this card is that red is one of the big colors for double team. Equipment's value mostly comes into play as being a way to have mana sinks in the late game because it's not an effective use of mana relative to doing something that also costs a card, like playing a creature. And the point in the game at which aggressive decks run out of mana is pushed back later and later into the game by the nature of double team. So I have ran into a lot of scenarios where I had a Fiend Lash in an aggressive deck and just cut it because I had better stuff to do. I don't think that will be every red deck situation. The lower your curve gets, I think the better Fiend Lash gets, because the more you need mana sinks in the late game. But I do also think that this is the kind of card that is possibly correct to not play some of the times in your red deck, even in your aggressive red decks. On the other side of things, Karlach is excellent and is a hyper bomb. A 2/2 first striker for 2 is a good card, and the red and black versions of this card and the white version are all like hyper bombs that come back from the graveyard for 6 mana, meaning they're also card advantage in addition to just being huge, powerful, first striking, hasty, board state devastating cards. Like, this is a really, really, really strong pull towards red and is excellent. Storm King's Thunder, on the other hand, is completely unplayable no matter what. Uthgardt Fury is really powerful and a pull towards red. I feel like I could go into discussing like, hey, this is all the ways this card like completely changes the nature of how the game functions for your opponent. But I don't need to. We can kind of leave that for some other time. It does that, and is also very good, and is a removal spell, and is cheap and effective, and it's great. Makes you want to play red. Flames of Moradin is basically unplayable. Don't consider it at all. Cardoom is a very, very excellent card that does everything you should want to be doing in this format, and it is very easy to have 1-drops. Like, this card does get worse if you have 0 1-drops. Most decks tend to have 1 or 2 1-drops that are good, and if you meet those requirements, Cardoom is excellent. Even if you don't meet those requirements, Cardoom is a 4-mana 4/3 with haste that is still good, that does start drawing cards if they don't kill it immediately the first turn that it attacks. It's excellent. Play it. Very strong draw towards red. Double red means it's not splashable, and it's a card that's not hyper impactful in the late game, so it's not even necessarily the kind of card that's worth a splash. So just try to play red as one of your 2 colors if you open Cardoom. Chaos Balor. Very, very strong. Excellent. Good stats for the cost. Flying. Has abilities that frequently just win the game if it attacks or dies. Notably, the biggest impact is that shooting your opponent's creatures for 2 damage will sometimes be concerning because you're perpetually pumping the ones that don't die, but will frequently Plague Wind them a lot of the time. And that's just excellent. And you getting to ramp yourself by 2 treasure tokens is also excellent because this is a format that's mostly about tempo. And then, like, Seek is weird and contextual and usually not relevant. Like, from your perspective, choosing to make your opponent Seek, you might as well consider that, like, 1, know that you will, if they are flooding, fix their flood, and you will never draw them into flood because of the way Seek works. But if you don't think your opponent's flooding because they're missing land drops, unless they know about Chaos Balor and you think they're holding lands for either Chaos Balor or Specialize, Chaos Balor is kind of just rad. And usually that's probably going to be better than giving your opponent treasure most of the time. Unless they're like empty-handed and you don't care and just want to do damage to them. But do bear in mind that you have to choose 2 modes, and you can't target your opponent with both of them or yourself with both of them, so you do always have to figure out which one is going at you and which one's going at the opponent. Anyway, excellent card, pulls you into red, and is fantastic once you are in red. Similarly, Wrathful Red Dragon. Great stats, good card, super relevant ability. You do randomly end up with a lot of dragons. Don't feel obligated to take this card and like, I need to maximize how many dragons I'm playing because I have Wrathful Red Dragon and they have synergy. Don't worry about it. Don't stress it. Maybe it changes what like your 23rd card is if there's some kind of dragon advantage versus some other consideration. But mostly this card is just stellar on its own and it needs no help, and the bonus is just a bonus. Play 5 mana 5/5 flyers, and this just also kills one of your opponent's creatures whenever it gets removed by a damage spell or gets blocked or has to chump block for whatever reason. It's great. Card's excellent. Will Pact-Bound Duelist, 3 red for a 4/4 that steals your opponent's 4-drop, and then next turn specializes and does something great that probably wins the game. Most of the times that I've played this, it's been the red mode that I chose to specialize into because getting to attack them with Will and the creature you stole, and then sacking the creature you stole to untap Will and attack for 5 again is like a truly deeply heinous amount of damage that if they don't have blockers to just eat your stuff is stellar. This is the probably other consideration for best card in the set. It is probably worse than Hourglass Coven, but it's close. It's legitimately close. I think I have won the turn after I've played Will every single time I've ever cast a Will. I would not take Lae'zel over Will. In my experience, like, Lae'zel is good. Lae'zel's really good. I think Will is better. Will is more linear in the type of deck that it goes in than Lae'zel. Lae'zel can be defensive. Will is, you are being aggressive, and will punish your opponent, or will reward you for playing Will in an aggressive deck. Will is also good in a slower deck, but less so, whereas Lae'zel is like great in all scenarios, but when Will is good, Will is amazing. If I was drafting and had to choose between Will and Tasha, I think that'd be a different consideration. Tasha is also super powerful, but doing the non-aggressive thing, I think, is worse. So I guess this is the thing. The reason that I'm so in love with Will, and also very in love with Lae'zel, is that they are excellent at doing the aggressive thing, and also the decks that they are in and support are excellent even if you don't draw them, because they are what you should be doing. The biggest problem with Tasha is that as amazing as Tasha is, the cards that go with Tasha and the color combination that Tasha is in are not good in the games where you don't draw the Tasha. In that case, they're not what I want to be doing. Any aggressive red deck, be it red-black, red-white, maybe red-green, but to a lesser extent, you can win games against bombs where you draw nothing but the commons in your deck when you are playing that. And that's the kind of like consistency that I think makes for really good sealed decks. Next up, Ancient Copper Dragon. 6 mana 6/5 flyer is a stat line that's just worth playing. I think this card's probably worse than like Wrathful Red Dragon or Chaos Balor, but I don't think you choose not to play a 6 mana 6/5 flyer. It's got an ability that's very good. When you connect, you get to like play the rest of your hand for the most part, and that's solid, but like that's not really the consideration for this card, in my opinion. Mostly you're here for the vanilla. Next up, Nalfeshni. I've opened this card multiple times. I've never managed to play it. I think like 90% of the idea of this card is that it plays well with adventure creatures. Like, you play this, and then when you cast your adventure creature from exile, you get 2 adventures. Or you get 2 copies of the creature. I don't know of that many other things that get cast from exile in this format. I'm sure there's something, and maybe you should like pay attention to it, but 99% of the time that's what you're looking for. The trouble is that there aren't really any good red adventure creatures that kind of synergize with what Nalfeshni is doing. There's Young Red Dragon, which is fine. White has the indestructible Hippogriff that is probably one of the more interesting cards to combo with Nalfeshni. But I would say 90% of the value of Nalfeshni, if you're considering playing it, is going to be a 6 mana 4/6, which is a solid blocker, but it's not the world's best attacker, it's fine. Every time that I've had this card, I considered playing it for the stats and then didn't because I just had better things to be spending my mana on once it's that expensive. Like, I think that absent any synergy concerns, this card's probably worse than Earthquake Elemental. Maybe you side it in if your opponent has a bunch of like 3/2 or 4/4 flyers at like their 6 and 7 drops, and then this becomes interesting. Don't feel bad if you don't play it. So moving on to green. Favorite enemy. A fight spell, 1 mana fight, generally, even at sorcery speed. The tempo potential makes this just worth playing. The fact that it also then often starts putting +1/+1 counters on creatures randomly throughout the course of the game, especially if your opponent is trying to do any kind of tribal thing, dragons being probably the most common tribal thing, is bonus. Play this if you're in green. It's not a strong reason to be in green. I guess don't play it if you don't have big creatures, maybe? I don't know. Why are you in green if you don't have big creatures? We do not know the answers to these questions. Oh, wait, this isn't the correct next card. Belt of Giant Strength. 2 mana equipment with... It turns a creature into a 10/10, and the equip cost is whatever the difference between their power and 10/10 is. It's... I haven't yet, played this. I don't think this draws you into green. I honestly don't know whether or not this is a card that you should play in a green deck. If somebody, smart told me this card was actually good, I would believe them. But I have not yet had a reason to strongly feel like I should try. I don't feel like this matters very much unless you're equipping it to something that has either flying, lifelink, or reach. And most of the stuff with flying has pretty low power. Flying, lifelink, or trample. Most of the stuff with flying has power low enough that this isn't really achievable. Maybe if you had a 4/4 flyer, you could equip this to it and hit them for 10, and that'd be cool. The stuff with trample, also mostly 4/4, so I guess maybe this upgrades your 5-drop 4/4 trampler into a 10/10 trampler, and that's good. But so many things have to go right, and you have to get so late in the game for this to be relevant. I don't think you should really care about this or want to run it. So next up, Wilson Bear Comrade. This card's really strong. It's a draw to green. It's hard for your opponent to kill. It randomly has reach for whatever reason. This card's value is mostly tied to its specialize. It's not super great if you don't specialize it, which actually means that in a weird way, this really isn't actually a 2-drop, and you shouldn't consider it one for curve purposes. It's fine for attacking your opponent, but it doesn't block ever, really. It's too valuable to block. And most of the double team creatures that you want to block don't either kill it or don't die to it. So it just doesn't do that. Functionally, this is not something that matters on curve. So think of this almost as a 3-drop into 4-drop, possibly. Although specializing it is still probably worse than playing most 4-drops. So it's a solid 6-drop in that sense, except it's got flexibility in terms of when you play it on the curve. It's good, but it's also more of a board stall card than anything else. This card is better than it seems, but I don't think that it's excellent either. Speaking of excellent though, Lucamina Moondruid is very, very, very good because the base rate is a 3-mana 2/2 that draws a land. And that's good. After you do that, if you specialize this card, it is excellent once it has specialized. I would bend over in a lot of different ways to contort myself into a scenario where I was not specializing this when my opponent is holding up instant speed interaction. Because every time I've played against this, I have either Dragon's Fired it or Crypt Plague? Sewer Plagued it in response to the specialization because my opponent was trying super hard to specialize it as fast as possible because it's busted once it's specialized. And the fact that my opponent consistently, knowingly played that way meant that I just had to play off curve, hold up an instant speed removal spell, and got my free, not quite 2-for-1, because Lucamina does draw a card, so a 2-for-2 of sorts, or I guess more like a 1-for-1, actually. but the tempo cost of getting blown out on the Specialize and not actually getting a card in play because of it, and having lost 2 turns worth of plays for your opponent's like 2 mana or 3 mana instant, is really harsh. So play this. Do not specialize it until you run out of other things to do or your opponent's tapped out. But do consider specializing it at ASAP once your opponent has tapped out. Just to protect him. Yuan Ti Scale Shield. 2 and a green instant, permanents you control gain indestructible and hexproof until end of turn, and then if your opponent has cast something, draw a card. All creatures you control gaining indestructible is an interesting combat trick, and the fact that it can be an instant combat trick while also having the opportunity to be card advantage that hits a creature of any size, meaning it's not stuck being 3 CMC or less in the late game. This card is flexible enough that I would play it if I was in green, probably about 100% of the time, and expect that at some point in the game I would get maybe a 2-for-1, maybe better out of it. That's the kind of potential that I want to have available in order to justify playing a 3-mana combat trick, but it's not strong enough that it's a pull into green. It's just a card that I probably will play 100% of the time once I'm in green. Monster Manual. Mill 5 cards, then return a creature card milled this way. It's supposed to synergize with the green-black theme of self-mill that mostly doesn't exist because there's no reasonable payoffs for it. And milling yourself in sealed is mostly a downside. This format's a little too aggressive for really any games to come down to milling that I've played yet, but I guess that'd be a downside in a grindy matchup between 2 grindy decks, and I have not seen that yet. If you are in a ramp deck that has, like, hypothetically enough 6-drops, this starts to get interesting as, okay, you play Monster Manual and then you activate the ability and you put your first 6-drop into play for 6 mana. And then your next 6-drop only costs 2 mana. And that's, like, fine. It's not really good. You need a lot of 6-drops before this starts to become too appealing, or else you need to have a bomb that you really want to splash Zoological Study for. This doesn't pull you very strong into green. It might be a consideration to play in some green decks. It is one of those cards that's also entirely reasonable to be in green and still just not play this. Gets more interesting once you start having 7-drops in your deck, but that's mostly only at Mythic or Rare. There is a 7-drop common in green that's good, but the trouble is that it's an adventure creature, and you can't use Monster Manual to put the adventure creature into play unless you didn't cast the adventure, and a lot of the value of that Lindworm is that the adventure is really good, so not really very much synergy there either. Next up, Polar Werebear. This card is really excellent and a strong pull towards green. It's got great stats for the mana cost. It's got hexproof so that it's hard for your opponent to answer. Notably, it loses hexproof when it does damage, meaning also to a creature. It doesn't just mean players. This is weirdly the most powerful splashable blue card in the entire set, because the ability to activate sacrificing a food and cast some of the many bombs that this card has in its spell book is deeply tied into being able to make blue. You can get away with only reliably activating this thing once, meaning, like, you can actually use a treasure to sack a food, because you're probably only going to activate it once. If you connect onto your opponent with this thing twice, you probably already won the game, or you gave this thing trample somehow. I have yet to see a card drafted out of this thing's spellbook, because everything possible was done to make sure it never hit the opponent. Or if my opponent did get a food off of it, I was sitting there just hoping there was no possible way that they top-decked into a blue source. All of that's kind of superfluous. If you are heavily incentivized to splash blue once you are playing this. You are heavily incentivized to play this because the base rate, even if you never find blue, is good and excellent. But if it connects and you draft a card and it hits like a 7-drop bomb, you win the game. So everything beyond its good base stats is extra. Traverse the Outlands. I literally didn't know this was in the set. I've never seen this card before. 4 and a green sorcery. Search your library for up to X basic land cards where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. That's probably reasonable. It's a lot of deck thinning. It's a lot of ramp. There's not a lot of actual 4-drops with decent power is the weirdest thing about this card. And if this is only getting 2 lands, it's not good. It needs to consistently get more than 2 lands. This is contextual. There might be decks where this is actually good. If it's like on curve getting 3 or 4 lands, it's interesting. It's more interesting if you have expensive things to play. There's not a lot of those. I'm not like get impressed or anything. I wouldn't strongly consider it at all when determining what colors to play. Next up, Ancient Bronze Dragon. 5 green for a 7/7 flyer. That's mostly what this card is. It's another one of these dragons that is good because its stat lines are good, and it's got a cool effect that isn't a downside when you hit your opponent. This is probably one of the weaker of these effects. I think the blue one is actively bad. The red one is interesting. This might be better than the red. It's close. The red dragon is better than this just based off the mana cost and stat lines being better on the whole. This is fine. You'll play it in green. I don't actually think this is like a hyper strong pull towards green because I just don't think 7-drops are like what swings the format, but like once you're in green, definitely play this. It kind of pulls the needle towards green, but I could see myself with a decent green ramp deck not playing the green ramp deck because I just have a better white-red deck of aggressive commons a lot of the time. Following that, Verdant Rejuvenation. 6 green sorcery. Seek X creature, enchantment, and or planeswalker cards where X is the highest mana value among creatures you control. Put those cards onto the field. I would have thought this card was a win more. I did have a ramp shell that I thought was pretty good that had like 5-drop cantrip creatures, 6-drop hill giants, had them kind of in abundance, and then had this, and I went really deep into that, and Verdant Rejuvenation actually felt pretty good. Having a lot of expensive cards meant that it was regularly grabbing a lot of things. They were expensive cards that were not likely to die on curve, and it meant that this went and got big, powerful creatures on average more often. That actually worked and was good. The biggest problem is that, like, again, kind of like Ancient Bronze Dragon, that is a strategy that you can build around that works. I could still, even if there was a viable build of that strategy, I don't think this card is so strong that it's worth playing that strategy, even if available, over a good white-red or red-black or white-black deck that's just doing powerful common and uncommon things where the default aggressive strategies are better. Next up, Earthquake Dragon. This card's really bad. I went out of my way to enable it, and it was fine. You will probably never, ever get a pool that makes this work, and you probably should be happy about that. Don't really even consider this. I mean, like, do. Maybe, but, like, don't. Don't, though. I had the nuts pool for it, and it still wasn't impressive. John Arenicus the Exile. 2 blue and a black for a 3/5. I'm going to probably disagree with most people here and say I don't think this card is good. And before you get upset, it is a good card. It's a powerful card to have in play. All of my complaints about blue are not invalidated by this card, although it's got a stat line that is better for stalling out the board than most other 4-drops. It's good at that. You probably still shouldn't be playing blue-black, and you probably should not get tricked into playing blue-black by having this card in your pool. You could splash this card. It looks like a mill card, and mill cards are often powerful and sealed when attached to this kind of effect. It looks like a card draw spell, and card draw spells are often good when you want to dirtle. The trouble is that this doesn't actually win the game by milling. Any aggressive deck will kill you long before this mills you to death. It's not actually a fast clock. And it is also a card draw spell, but it's like intermittently a card draw spell that doesn't always draw cards, like draws cards most of the time, but sometimes not the first turn that it comes down. The majority of this card's power level is actually tied to the fact that it's got a really good set of stats for 4 mana, but that alone is not enough to justify splashing, and maybe you've got nothing better to do than splash this card. But, like, are you splashing it in green-black, where you have the color fixing? That's not great. Most of the time, it is probably going to be better to just play a lean deck with good mana than splashing this card. So, yeah, it's fine. Don't super strongly consider it. Probably play an aggressive deck over jumping into it because you see that you open this card. Blue-black still isn't a color combination you actually want to play, because blue isn't a color you want to play. Now, to kind of walk that back, Tasha Unholy Archmage is really close to the strongest card. The only reason it definitely isn't the strongest card is because blue-black still isn't a good color. Tasha is fantastic to have in play. The uptick is amazing. It's hard to understate, if you haven't actually seen this card in play, how brutally Tasha's uptick completely redefines the entire scope of the game. But you won't always draw it, and when you don't draw it, the other 99% of your blue-black deck is, well, aside from some of the good black cards, usually not great. So, if I open Tasha, I am going to consider, hey, what can I do that results in me being able to splash Tasha in a black deck? But I am not going to play blue-white splashing Tasha. The majority of the time, I'm not going to play blue-red, I'm not going to play blue-green. Those color combinations just aren't great, and it is very, very difficult to put together any kind of dirtily mid-range list that can just be 4-color slow bomb nonsense. So your options for what you can do to play Tasha are limited. It's really, really powerful, but be willing to not play Tasha if playing Tasha means having a deck that just isn't good if you do not draw the Tasha. Most pools have better options than that. And I think Tasha might wind up being one of the cards that is most responsible for people opening pools that they do not day 2 with. Because it is so powerful, and it will win games when you play it, and it will probably make you lose 2 matches because you will have 2 matches before 7 wins where you just didn't find Tasha. It's weird. I don't know. This card is great. Look for every option you can to play it without going away from an aggressive deck that you should be trying to build to begin with. Prosper Tomebound. 2 black red for a 1/4 death touch. It's hard to kill. It's not like the best at dealing damage, but it blocks forever. At the beginning of your end step, exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. And whenever you play a card from exile, create a treasure token. This card's excellent. Huge amount of card draw, good blocker. This is probably one of the best cards that isn't actively aggressive. It's so much tempo advantage, it's so much card advantage. It is everything that justifies taking a breather to not be aggressive for a second, and it's in a good color combination that you have a reason to be in anyway. And also in a color combination where both black and red are, even if you're not playing actual Rakdos, very capable of making treasure to splash the other half of the card. Great card. Raphael Fiendish Savior. 3 black and a red for a 4/4 flyer. Good base rate. Other demons, devils, imps, and tieflings you control get +1/+1 and have lifelink. That lifelink bit is the bit that is absolutely stellar. At the beginning of each in-step, if a creature card was put into your graveyard from anywhere this turn, create a 1/1 red devil creature token that is also a 2/2, and when it dies, pings, and it has lifelink. This card's amazing. Very strong pull towards red-black. Again, same thing as Prosper, where these are color combinations that inherently mean that this card is easier to splash because you're in colors that make treasures. It's great. It's very good. Try to play it. Then after that, Minsk and Boo Timeless Heroes. 3 red and a green for a 3/3 loyalty planeswalker that when it enters the battlefield or at the beginning of your upkeep, if you don't control Boo, create Boo, who is a 1/1 legendary red hamster creature token with trample and haste. And then Minsk upticks to put 3 +1/+1 counters on any creature with trample or haste, and can downtick to sacrifice a creature, fling it for its power worth of damage, and draw its power worth of cards. This card is excellent, strongly makes you want to play it, strongly makes you want to splash it. It's very difficult to kill. It makes a 4/4 immediately, and then continues to make more 4/4s. It races well because the 4/4 has haste in any position where you don't need to hang back to block. Card's excellent. Pulls you into these colors. Try to splash it if possible. Very excellent. Ragadraga Gorgut's Boss. 4 mana 4/4 is just a really good stat line in this set, so like the base rate of this card is almost appealing enough to be kind of tempting. Everything else about it is weirdly contextual to your specific pool, and especially creatures you have that tap for mana, which is kind of a thing Green wants to do already. But like, there will be times where this card goes and becomes excellent. Remember, you have to build a pool that's functional when you don't draw Ragadraga, but if the rest of your green-red pool that's playing Mana Dorks is just doing the good things that Mana Dork pools already want to do, then the base rate on this card is excellent, and it just gives you gravy on top of that. But remember not to fall into the trap of building too much around it and building a non-functional deck when you don't draw it. Ketty is mostly just a bad card because there's not really equipments that you generally want to play. Don't play bad equipment to make this card better. Don't get pulled into this color combination. Mostly this is a somewhat tricky to cast 2 mana 2/2 first strike reach, which is fine, and that's about it. It is not great because that's not great on its own. Nalia de Arnis, 1 white and a black for a 3/3. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast party spells from on top of your library, and if you have a full party, which you won't ever, do things that you won't ever do. Mostly this is a 3 mana 3/3 that sometimes draws cards. If you're in white, black, and your pool actually supports this, which it probably will because black and white on average have a lot of clerics and rogues, but some pools don't, then this is probably good. I don't actually think this is a super powerful draw into white-black. There are better commons than this. Well, yeah, probably. There are definitely better uncommons than this, but if it's in your pool, be aware of it. Not a huge pull, though. On the other hand, Asterion the Decadent is a very, very, very good card that is a pull towards white-black, which are also colors you just kind of want to play anyway. Black is a color that's sort of capable of splashing white. This is the kind of late-game card that's deeply powerful and very worth splashing. Gains you life, has death touch, kills things, kills your opponent really fast, is sort of a lava axe. Is a good card. Near a Wild Mage. Weird stat lines, expensive, does things... What does this even do? I've never seen anybody put this into play. Whenever you cast a spell, you can instead cast the top spell of your library without paying its mana cost once per turn. It is not particularly good, and don't splash it because it's not particularly good, and the stat lines are bad for a 6-drop, and it's blue. Don't. It's bad. Eh. Baba Lysaga, Night Witch. This card fills 2 roles. One is that it's a 4 mana 4/4. And if you're in green-black for whatever reason, a 4 mana 4/4 is something that you're interested in. The other half of it is basically a question of how many artifact creatures do you have in your deck. The more artifact creatures you have, the better this card is. So the 3-drop Thopter artifact that goes and tutors a land is the card that pairs particularly interestingly with this, because it fixes for whichever half of this you're splashing, probably green, because you're more likely to be playing black than green. And then this sacks that Thopter and the land you drew to drain your opponent for 3 and draw 3 cards, and that's excellent. I think that is worth splashing if that option is available to you, but if you don't have artifact creatures, I don't think this card is particularly deeply appealing. In green-black, you can't sack... You have to have an artifact or enchantment, basically, to make this card playable. So, if you're in green-black, 4 mana 4/4 vanilla, good. Basically don't consider the ability to exist unless you have a random enchantment in your deck, and that's not ideal. But mostly, how many artifact creatures do you have? And don't play artifact creatures that are bad that you wouldn't play outside the norm. Ulda Ravengard is a very, very, very powerful card that supports what you should already be doing in terms of trying to do double team stuff if possible, trying to do aggressive stuff if possible. Huge amount of card advantage, good stat line on curve, really powerful draw into either of these colors, and also worth splashing. Are there treasure tokens in green-black? There are only treasures in red-black. I don't believe there are any other ways to make treasures. But green does have a number of solid playable cards that tap for any color of mana, which fill the same role as treasures for the purpose of splashing. Alundo the Seer, 2 green-blue for a 3/5 with a very convoluted ability that says a lot of things that, because of rules minutia, and for you who know what this means, it does not grant the cards suspend. They do not lose counters turn by turn. They only lose counters when you activate Alundo. Mostly mean this is a kind of fine stat line that's decently defensive and is basically Merfolk Looter. It's basically a 4 mana 3/5 Merfolk Looter and not very much else. Don't splash for it and do everything within your power to not play blue, so mostly don't play this card ever. Did I skip one? I skipped the other version of Baba Lysaga that was not actually on Arena. It's one of the cards that there is an alchemy rebalancing of for some reason. I don't know why. Presumably to differentiate it from a paper card with the same name that has different abilities. Mazzy True Sword Paladin. I actually have never seen this. I did not know that it existed. Naya for a 3/4. Whenever an enchanted creature attacks one of your opponents, it gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. You generally don't enchant anything in this format with the exception of the one decent red uncommon aura. Whenever an aura you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, exile it until the end of your next turn, you may cast that card. That's also not relevant. Okay, so that's why I haven't seen it. It's because it's a bad card. Gorian Wise Mentor. Green, white, and blue for a 3/4 vigilance. If you are in these colors, that's a solid stat line for 3. Whenever you cast an adventure spell, you may copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. That's really not super good. Blue does have 2 good adventure creatures. The 5-drop dragon, that's adventure is 2 mana draw a card, and the 7-drop dragon, whose adventure is 2 mana bounce a card. But, like, I hate blue. I don't want to play 3 colors. I guess playing 2 colors splash blue, but like it is so likely you have a better 2-color pool that just gets to do aggressive stuff than trying to play this. You need to open such a perfect storm blue pool that has those adventure dragons, has the bounce dragons, somehow has like the ability to have a good curve in addition to that, with good defensive creatures against the double team decks that are just going to be killing you, and also have the fixing to go 3 color, and then Gorian rewards you and kind of gives you a good stat line, except it's a good stat line on curve, not necessarily a good stat line once you've fixed all 3 colors. Mostly not appealing. Jan Jansen Chaos Crafter. This card's good. The stat line's solid. Mostly, I think that this is a really reasonable card to play off of treasures because it sacks treasures to be a resource engine. It is in a color that gets to... Red and black both get to fix for whatever color you're missing because of the way treasure production works. There are a lot of synergies in red-black that really reward you for having treasures. This also rewards you for having treasures by converting them into colorless constructs. This card's good. It's actually easy to fix for. It's solid. Consider what your options are regarding it anytime you see it in your pool. Miriam, Sentinel Worm. So this is 6 mana, 6/6 Flyer Ward 2, which is really good. Whenever another non-token dragon enters the battlefield under your control, copy it. This card is really good. I have splashed for it. I splashed for it in a Selesnya deck and was still impressed by that. I do think this card is always worth, anytime you open it, looking at what your options are for how to play it. The usual considerations of probably don't get baited into playing blue as one of your main colors, even if you got a bunch of dragons in blue, because the rest of blue still sucks and doesn't do 2-drop and 3-drop things, and it's really hard to build a 2-drop and 3-drop functional curve in a format defined by aggro from one color, but this is a really powerful card. It has even more powerful synergies. It's great even if the synergies don't come online. If the opportunity cost of jumping through these hoops is not too high, this is a cool card, and it can be worth jumping through the hoops for. Anytime you open it, build the pool, see if it's possible. And then be willing to admit that maybe it's still, even if it comes together, maybe it's still worse than white-red. Next up, Basilisk Collar. A really good piece of equipment that changes the context of any deck. If you open it, you play it. It's colorless. Fraying Line. I thought this card would be pretty good, and it is. It is one of the few cards that I think is almost more defensive than offensive, which is, multiple cards that is true of. This is one of the few cards that, like, actually really excels at that role and does that job while also being an advantage. The closest comparison I think that still actually has borne out is that this card feels a lot like Tanglewire, where you play it and your opponent has to slow down. Either they immediately get their entire board wiped, while you presumably don't get your one creature wiped, or they're playing 2 mana behind the curve every turn. But I would say the majority of the time that you play Fraying Line, when I have played it, it has been in the developing stage of the game, somewhere in the first 5 turns, with the expectation that my opponent would either let the Fraying Line immediately go off, or would pay for the Fraying Line and save their best creature, and then not play any other creatures, because they don't want to play into the Fraying Line, and then I sack the Fraying Line anyway. If you are planning to continue paying for Fraying Line every turn, if you are in the late game where players have ran out of things to do with their mana, if you are not going to choose to blow up the fraying line on your turn, I think that late game fraying line is pretty bad at. It is so like try to warp your play around the logic of if your opponent doesn't sack fraying line at the first opportunity, you will. If you do that, I think this card is good. I think that it is probably worth playing in almost every pool that can do it, outside of maybe the most hyper-aggressive decks. But, like, I've been impressed with this card in every deck I've put it in, outside of the scenarios where going in knowing this card is going to be pretty not great in the turbo late game. And I think that it's okay for a card to not be good there, which is weird because this looks like a Wrath and it's kind of, meh. But anyway, I think this card's good. If you haven't been playing it, mess around with it more. It might be the way you are trying to play it that doesn't work more than the card not being good. Mirror of Life Trapping. So this, basically the idea is doubles every ETB, but that also benefits your opponent if they have lots of ETBs. The only time I would ever consider playing this is if I like randomly opened a pool and was already encouraged to be like playing black-white that just had a huge amount of really impressive ETB effects. Like so far and above beyond the normal amount of ETB effects that I was expecting to get way more value than my opponent out of it. The more I'm talking about this, the more I feel like I should just say, don't play this card. There is scenarios in which this card is playable, but remember that it benefits your opponent, so you're hyper unlikely to get 4 mana and a card worth the value out of that. You will save yourself a lot of headache if you just consider this card to not exist. Baldur's Gate. This card doesn't exist. Be sad if you open it. Don't play it.